I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you today. My presentation will focus on the steps you can take in your next city or county development plan to integrate biodiversity considerations into the plan. I hope to demonstrate to you that there are many practical ways in which you can shape your city or county development plan to benefit biodiversity, and in so doing, to benefit the communities you serve. The presentation is based primarily on feedback that my team has been providing in response to development plan issues papers across the country in recent months. You'll see who we are on this slide, and also there's some contact details there. And we want to engage with you as effectively as possible to assist you in drafting your next development plan. In relation to the divisions referred to there on the slide, the Northern Division is the red and orange, the Western Division is the green and light blue, the Southern Division is the pink and purple, and the Eastern Division are the two blues to the right of the screen. While we have a wide-ranging role, our role in this context is to advocate for biodiversity to be fully integrated into development plans. This reflects the government's policy to protect, manage and restore biodiversity as set out in the National Biodiversity Plan and reflected in the National Planning Framework, the NPF. This in turn reflects the EU's aims and objectives in this area to halt and reverse biodiversity decline, which in turn is in keeping with international commitments as part of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. You'll all be aware from the media and from this slide here demonstrating it that biodiversity is declining rapidly worldwide. We know that this not only has consequences for wildlife, but for our lives too. In the EU since the 1990s, there has been a loss, for example, of 32% of farmland birds, 40% of grassland butterflies, and in some parts up to 80% of pollinating insects. Losses of pollinating insects alone threaten future food production. As set out in the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030, we must work together to halt biodiversity loss and then restore it as part of our efforts in ensuring that lives and livelihoods are sustained in the 21st century and beyond. Our first task is to ensure that the provisions of current legislation and policy in this area are fully and effectively implemented. The good news is that there are many practical steps that you can take, that we all can take indeed, in relation to the protection and restoration of biodiversity. You'll see here that in relation to all of our goal to achieve sustainable development, that biodiversity underpins everything that we do. And so we must make common cause, I think, in this regard. In relation to biodiversity, local action is global action because each county and city in Ireland has its own suite of habitats and species, each in need of protection and restoration in a unique local setting and context. Your work in identifying land use policies and objectives which can integrate biodiversity in a proactive and precautionary way is therefore hugely significant, and it is this work that we seek to support. As you will all be aware, this is also a requirement of Section 10 of the Planning Act, and it's encompassed by Objectives 58, 59 and 60 of the National Planning Framework. In protecting and restoring biodiversity, a key focus must be the protection and restoration of the habitat types and species for which our European sites, our special areas of conservation and our special protection areas have been designated. This is together with sites which have been designated at a national level, which includes national natural heritage areas and nature reserves. And beyond this, there should be a focus on habitats in the wider landscape, which are also important for biodiversity, and such as hedgerows, wetlands, coastal habitats, and many others, and on the many species protected by the provisions of the Habitats and Birds Directives and by the Wildlife Acts. In achieving this goal, there needs to be clear and robust objectives in your development plan, including objectives to protect, conserve and enhance biodiversity both within and outside protected areas. All the development plans we review have a good suite of such policies and objectives, and we generally recommend that this section of the plan is reviewed and objectives added or strengthened as required. This may mean, for example, adding an objective in relation to invasive species or adding an objective to ensure that environmental assessment is carried out as appropriate. In addition to these policies, which are often contained in a standalone chapter of the development plan, there needs to be a focus on other aspects of the plan and its implications for biodiversity. In order for this to happen, you need to be aware of the biodiversity resources in your county or city. And here I'd like to commend the work that has been undertaken by many councils across the country in undertaking wetland surveys or hedgerow surveys or various habitat surveys in different parts of the country. This work greatly adds to knowledge nationally, but also crucially adds to the evidence base which you can use to inform your next draft development plan. Using available information in this way will ensure that proposals which are brought forward support biodiversity protection and restoration. And this is where SEA and AA can assist you also. For example, at SEA scoping stage and at environmental report stage, there's an opportunity to consider the biodiversity baseline and to define the particular pressures that biodiversity is under in your county or city. By reviewing the environmental report for your region's regional, spatial and economic strategy, you can begin to understand the regional picture and the biodiversity resource at this level. Work in relation to appropriate assessment will give you and your team a better understanding of the biodiversity in European sites and the pressures the habitats and species there are subject to. This biodiversity evidence base will provide you with the information you need to guide policy and objectives in the draft plan, ensuring that policy in areas like housing or transport, infrastructure, energy, tourism, recreation, and climate all work to support the protection and restoration of biodiversity. Both SEA and AA are crucial processes in this regard. These assessments are not ends in themselves. Their only purpose is to guide plan making to ensure that a high level of protection for the environment and for biodiversity is achieved. Crucial to success here is close integration between the plan team and the SEA and AA team. It's also crucial that environmental issues are brought to the fore as early as possible in the process, so that key considerations flowing from the analysis of environmental evidence informs the emerging plan. We strongly advocate the use of the Environmental Sensitivity Mapping web tool and the EPA's excellent resources in relation to SEA, which are available on their website. I'd now like to provide some key suggestions emerging from our recent review of over a dozen issues papers for development plans across the country. I'll cover 4 areas that we consider merit comment and attention. Firstly, I'd like to talk a little bit about greenfield development. We fully support the compact growth model set out in the National Planning Framework. As the NPF points out, over-reliance on greenfield development is associated with environmental impacts, including habitat loss and fragmentation. Where there is a need to zone greenfield land for development, this must be informed by an understanding of the local biodiversity resource. In choosing which lands to zone for new development, there should be a focus on avoiding impacts to biodiversity in the first instance, together with a focus on reducing impacts once lands have been selected. In particular, impacts to key resources such as European sites can be avoided through careful consideration at this stage. Once lands are selected, consideration should be given to retaining important landscape elements that we know are important for biodiversity while providing for new development. This includes small wetlands, woodlands, groups of mature trees, hedgerows, and riparian corridors along rivers. Providing for this at the plan making stage, whether this is a development plan or a local area plan, means that results at the level of the individual development contribute to a wider landscape level result in terms of biodiversity protection and enhancement. In this regard, We fully support and welcome the NPF's call for a green infrastructure and ecosystem services approach to be incorporated into the preparation of statutory land use plans and the resulting policy in this regard, which is set out in the regional, spatial and economic strategies. Second issue I'd like to talk a little bit about is tourism. Where tourism initiatives are being proposed, it's important to understand that tourism is underpinned by our landscape and its rich natural and cultural heritage resources. This is a part of Ireland's unique selling point internationally, and one that is commented on in every Fáilte Ireland survey of tourists who visit this country over many years. Protecting these resources, therefore, will protect tourism in the long term. It's important to ensure that tourism developments take the need to protect and sustain biodiversity seriously and take these matters into account at the earliest stage of planning such initiatives. Planning strategically for tourism development is also important, taking into account the carrying capacity of different locations. Where areas are important for nature conservation, such as our coast, our rivers, and our lakes, this must be recognised and policy framed accordingly. Policy should not be formulated on the basis that issues can be sorted out at the project level with little consideration for biodiversity at plan making stage. Rather, policy should be evidence-based and formulated in ways which seek to protect, restore and sustain biodiversity from the outset. The second, or the third item I want to talk about really are greenways. Sustainable transport is vital for our future, and the development of greenways, cycleways and walking routes is most welcome. As advised in the National Greenway Strategy, greenways and linear trails should be designed taking into account and avoiding where necessary the sensitivities of our natural heritage. Commitments to specific routes are best not made in development plans in the absence of the necessary detailed environmental assessment. This is because many of the same risks to nature conservation interests and biodiversity, which are associated with all linear developments, arise in relation to cycleways and walkways. These include, for example, and as you can see from the slide here, this is a mock-up of a proposed walking and cycling route in North County Dublin. But you can see here that provision of such a facility at the very least involves land take, it involves habitat loss potentially, disturbance through lighting potentially, and just disturbance by increased usage, where in the past some of these areas would have been used by very few people. So our recommendation is that greenway proposals are subject to route selection processes to ensure that significant impacts to biodiversity can be avoided in the first instance, including impacts to European sites, and then appropriate mitigation measures are put in place as required once a route has been selected. And lastly, then I just want to spend a couple of moments talking about water. First of all, I want to say that we fully support and commend the work of the local authorities' water programme in working to meet our obligations under the Water Framework Directive and in the development and implementation of our river basin management plans. In formulating development plans, authorities must ensure that increased demands on wastewater systems and increased demands for water supply don't lead to a further deterioration in water quality, with consequent impacts to biodiversity, including impacts to European sites. We also support and encourage the use of sustainable drainage systems to manage surface water, which among other things provides benefits for biodiversity when such systems are well designed. In particular, appropriate riparian setbacks support the attainment of high ecological status for water bodies and the conservation of biodiversity in our rivers and streams. There are plenty of excellent recommendations in the recently updated Inland Fisheries Ireland document, Planning for Watercourses in the Urban Environment, and which I commend to you, and as I say, which is full of lots of good and practical suggestions. And we also discourage to the maximum extent possible the culverting and realignment of rivers, streams and other watercourses. And where culverting must take place, And as I say, we really want to emphasize that this should be minimized. We want to see ecologically friendly box culverts used rather than piped culverts. Again, there's guidance from IFI and indeed from OPW in relation to these matters, and I recommend that you consult these sources in that regard. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope that it has been some use, and as I say, our aim is to support you in formulating development plans which fully integrate biodiversity considerations into the plan, into these plans, and I hope that the presentation has given you some food for thought. Thank you.